Welcome to Manage Your Damn Money with Ben and Malcolm, where we trade in personal finance advice for entertaining conversations about money. And I recently realized if I didn't have to pay student loans, I probably could afford a gently used BMW X5. Now, ain't that some? Welcome to Manage Your Damn Money with Ben and Malcolm, where we, of course, trade in personal finance advice for entertaining conversations about money. I'm joined here, as always, by my co-host, Mr. Malcolm Ethridge. What's going on, Malcolm?
Not too much, man. Another day, another dollar, as you like to say.
As they say, man. Interesting thing that I just said and how I really realized that, like, for the first time ever, I took account of what I pay in student loans. Mm-hmm. And for the first time, I thought about what else I could buy.
Why would you want to depress yourself that way?
But it was funny both because of like realizing it in that sense, but then also the fact that that was the first time that I thought about it that way.
I'll give you the same reality check that I always give everybody else who goes down that rabbit hole of how different their life would be today if they didn't have to pay student loans today.
Right.
How different would your life be today if you didn't have the degrees that you're paying for?
Well,
so there's your trade-off, right? Like,
go.
would you still be able to afford that BMW X5 lifestyle without all these degrees that you have that you're paying for?
Unlikely. It's one of those, like, half a dozen in the other,
right.
6 in the hand, whatever the saying is. You know the saying because you're an old man. But of course, this is another episode of Manage Your Damn Money, and on this episode, the conversation at hand is a single word: percentages. We're going to be discussing percentages on this show, and we'll explain what we mean by percentages a little later. But first, before we get into that, it is now time for headlines. Headline this week, Malcolm: Congressmen are sleeping in their offices to save money, saying, quote unquote, "I can't afford an apartment." This was a MarketWatch.com piece in May of 2018 by Marissa Schultz. Crying poverty amid decade-long stagnant salaries and Washington's steep cost of living, an increasing number of House lawmakers, so on the House side, have turned into professional squatters at night, hitting the sack in their Capitol Hill offices on everything from cots and closets to futons stashed behind constituent couches to save a few bucks during the work week, Malcolm. Washington is too expensive, said Representative...
Go figure.
said Representative Dan Donovan, who's a Republican from New York, who credits the cot that he sleeps on and a tiny alcove in his office as the reason he is able to serve in Congress while still paying his New York housing costs. It's funny because they use the word alcove, and I don't know that I know what that means.
You sure it's not alcove?
It might be.
There you go. There you go.
Right. So if we go to the point where you have to rent or have to buy in D.C., then only millionaires would be members of Congress, he said. I don't think that was the intent of our founding fathers. Proposed legislation set to be introduced into the House as soon as this month, which would be May, would prohibit politicians from turning their offices into makeshift sleeping quarters, arguing that the move is violating IRS and congressional ethics rules. Another quote from another congressperson: "Look, it's unhealthy, it's nasty. I wouldn't want to be entertained in someone's bedroom," said Representative Benny Thompson, who's a Democrat from Mississippi, who is among those spearheading this bill to prevent Congress people from sleeping in their quarters. "Sleeping in your office is not proper," he says, ethically either. You can get free cable, free electricity, free janitorial services, free security, no rent. It's a heck of a deal. It probably comes out to $25,000 to $30,000 a year that isn't claimed at tax time. Mm-hmm. Many of them previously got extra compensation or per diem when they served in their home state legislatures to cover their living expenses while at the state capitol. But members of the House do not, and I don't think Congress, they get that. Members of the U.S. House of Representatives receive a salary of $174,000 a year, a figure that hasn't increased in nearly a decade, and they don't get a housing allowance. And they also work in a city, the city that we live and work and play in, Malcolm, where a one-bedroom pad can start at $2,000 a month. Mm-hmm. Meanwhile, they also have to pay to maintain their residence in their home state, which is a big deal because, you know, they're essentially having to pay two housing costs because you have to, of course, maintain your address where are a senator or House of Representative from. And as of now, no senators are known to be living in their offices. That was like a footnote in the story. But Malcolm, how do you feel about members of the House of Representatives copping a squat in their offices?
To quote Nelson from The Simpsons, I think that's hilariously a case of the chickens coming home to roost.
Wow. Okay.
In a lot of scenarios where you've had people for years and years and years and years and years begging Congress / the Senate,
right,
the government in general, to
right,
do something about the housing crisis that is.
Right.
For, let's call it 50% of the country. I don't even know what the number is.
Right.
But 50% of the country that just cannot afford these inflated housing prices that have been going up and up and up for the last 10 years.
Right.
Everybody's been making a big deal about it. Everybody knows it exists. But for whatever reason, these same congressmen and women haven't done very much about it to try and curtail the problem.
Right.
But now they're feeling the pinch as well. So in D.C., for 15 years I've lived it. I've seen people from communities that have been getting gentrified and the cost of living has just been going exponentially higher than anything we've ever seen before get displaced. Right. And they can't keep up with it because a lot of other market forces are working against them. But now you have these people who make, six figures complaining that
comfortable
they too can't afford to live in the place that they're the ones who actually set the rent in some ways in these places. So,
it's a little bit of super irony in my opinion. One of those you just sit back and laugh at, and there's not much else you can do about it.
I tell you what, though, I better not ever hear any of those senators who are living rent-free on my tax dollars complaining about government subsidies for poorer individuals in this country.
Oh, man.
Any of those people who are talking about cutting entitlement programs and whatever, that's a heck of an entitlement living rent-free on my American taxpayer dollars, okay? So I have no sympathy in that regard if there are any of those people living in that situation.
That's funny. You kind of hit on it, Malcolm, the state of affordable housing in D.C. and other major cities. We talk about a legislative solution with the assumption that legislation can do something about it. What's a realistic short to midtermish goal that can be done to actually address what is a housing crisis in terms of shortage of housing available, and also the level of expense that a lot of these places to live actually sit at?
Honestly, I think it might be too late. I know that's not very encouraging, and that doesn't really, that's a glass half empty way to look at it. But I honestly think it's a bridge too far. We've basically gotten to the point where if you can't afford to live in the city, you move out of the city.
Right.
If you can't afford to live in the state, you move to another state.
Right.
I think that's kind of where we've gotten to. But then you're seeing people in St. Paul, Minnesota are complaining that there's no more affordable housing in St. Paul, Minnesota because people who used to live in New York City and D.C. and Florida have moved there and taken over and brought their inflated incomes and raised the cost of housing and everything else. So everybody's in search of that affordable living area that also has something attractive about it socially. It's just becoming tougher and tougher to find it at a rate that you can actually afford, that a reasonable salaried person can actually afford. Right. And so I really think we're just at a point where
we're up a creek.
We're up a creek. We'll see how it shakes out, but that's just the way I see it. I think you're just gonna have to ride it out. I mean, legislatively, to your point though, the only thing I think you can really do is raise wages. You can raise the minimum wage in these areas to make it so that it's a little bit more livable. Right. But aside from that, and we've already seen the pushback that comes from that, I don't really know what else there is. What other lever you can pull?
Indeed. I myself have no suggestions or solutions. It certainly is a problem. Hopefully we can semi-solve it at some point. But of course, we want to remind people you're listening and watching Manage Your Damn Money with Ben and Malcolm. Today's conversation at hand is percentages, but before that, we're going to take a quick music break. But before we do, we want to remind you, you can always catch us on Apple Podcasts, SoundCloud, Stitcher, Google Play, and Spotify. Please leave us a review. That helps us go up in the ratings. Also, if you have a question for us or for Malcolm that you want him to answer during his Malcolm's Money Minute, simply send us an email, info@manageyourdamnmoney.com. And also, you can catch us on social media on Instagram and Twitter. Malcolm, what's your handle?
@MalcolmOnMoney.
And of course, mine is @MYDM1. And you can always catch us on Facebook, facebook.com/manageyourdamnmoney. This is MYDM with Ben and Malcolm. We will be right back. Welcome back to Manage Your Damn Money with Ben and Malcolm. Today's conversation at hand is a simple word, a single word. It is percentages. Here at MYDM, we pride ourselves on taking suggestions for shows, and thanks to one of our members of our crew, we're covering a very simple concept that can be described in a single word, percentages. What percentage of your income should you be saving? What percentage should you be spending on housing? What about a car or even your student loans? How we allocate our income across our responsibilities and for the future is a major determinant of our financial health, and that's why we're taking a look at how much we should spend on what. Malcolm, the first story that we pulled for this piece today was how much of my monthly income should I spend on a mortgage? That's the headline that we pulled. And that was a piece on Forbes.com by Trulia, and it was from March 2017. The first item that they mentioned that you should do when you're calculating costs for mortgage in particular, calculate the true monthly cost. If you want an in-depth look at your potential mortgage payment, look for a mortgage calculator that includes costs like homeowners insurance or property taxes. You want more than just the sales price and the loan interest rate to get like whether or not you can afford the mortgage. Of course, your monthly insurance premiums and property taxes will depend on what you buy and where you live. When determining how much of a monthly income you can spend on a mortgage payment, you need to add both these costs in. To get an accurate estimate, call insurance providers for a quote and look up the property taxes in your city or county you plan to buy in.
Yeah, so if you're looking, just to draw that out a little bit, if you're looking on a website like Zillow or Redfin or somebody,
right,
in addition to giving you like the estimated value of the house, they actually give you the last few years of tax assessment on that too.
Right.
So it makes it very easy if
it's up to you to do the math to add it though.
If you are diligent enough to do the work,
right,
they give you the information to answer those questions.
Because if you're feeling good about yourself, you'll leave that out and it'd be like, yeah, I can afford this mortgage.
Well, if you live like in places in the Northeast, like even further north than D.C., you're looking at almost like 2% a year in some cases for property taxes tacked onto the cost of the house. So we just got done talking about how houses cost too much. Now we're talking about tacking on 2% of the value of that $300,000, $400,000, $600,000 house you're buying.
Right.
That adds up very quickly because that's an annual cost. That's not just like a.
And you also have to remember that taxes are change based on who's in office, what the legislature is doing. So they can change technically. They can go up or they can go down.
How desirable your neighborhood and county and all that. Yeah.
All those things factor in. Another item that the piece mentioned is know the limits on lenders. According to a Mortgage Reform and Anti-Predatory Lending Act, a section of the Dodd-Frank Act of 2010, an entity lending money for a mortgage cannot underwrite the loan unless they determine you can reasonably repay it. And I think one of the things that they do, because I've been going through the home buying process myself, which I shared a couple of shows ago, our house is like a new, quote unquote, new build. But
quote unquote.
Well,
look at that humble brag.
Oh my God. Anyway, so it's one of those things where they've actually checked in with us in the months leading up to the actual close, just to see if we're still able
to make sure you didn't do anything stupid.
To make sure we haven't like tricked off a whole bunch of money. And I didn't even realize it until recently. The last one we did, I was like, wait a minute. This is just like going to the doctor to see if my, cholesterol is still good. And the guy,
not just that though, going to the doctor who told you,
right,
don't eat any more salt.
Right.
Okay. I don't care what else you eat.
Right.
Every day, don't eat any more salt.
Right.
And then they check back in with you every month or so to make sure you actually did what they told you to.
Right.
Otherwise, gonna be some consequences and repercussions.
It's hilarious. I asked the loan officer guy. I said, so this is basically like going to a doctor's for a checkup. He was like, exactly. Yes, that's what this is. And I'm like, oh, all right. So I finally figured it out. Another item mentioned, your mortgage should take up, or another thing to remember, your mortgage should take up no more than 28% of your monthly income. You can use 28% as your general rule of thumb when making a budget for buying a home. Here's an easy formula. Multiply your monthly income by 28, then divide that by 100. The answer is 20% of your monthly income. The median income in the U.S. is $55,000. If this were your income, you'd make about $4,000 and some change per month. 28% of that of income comes out to about $1,300. So that person who is making $55,000 a year should ideally, at least by this standard, be spending no more than about $1,300 on their mortgage or rent or whatever it is. Another item listed, consider subtracting other essential expenses such as childcare, which is also an expensive, absurd cost in D.C., and also transportation costs, which can be expensive depending upon, if you don't have public transit, you have to have a car or a reliable car. From your monthly expenses. In addition, your lender will also consider student loans, car loans, and also, of course, credit card debt. One rule of thumb, spend a fixed percentage of your income on housing. The general recommendation is to spend about 30% or less of your gross monthly income before taxes on rent. And I think that's like the old, as they say, old wives' tale. That's the old wives' percentage that they say you're not supposed to go above when paying for housing, which is 30%.
So, yeah, somewhere between 30 and 33%, 33 being kind of like the upper limit that I've heard on this, depending on who you talk to. But also, to your point, I've heard so many times in recent past that is kind of a thing of the past.
Okay.
Because I read articles, and unfortunately, I can't even quote any of them by name to give them their just due, because I read so much stuff on a regular basis. But anyway, they've basically said that in some cases, people who are in like our age cohort, the millennial generation, for example, are spending 50% in some cases of their gross income.
Wow.
Not even after they've paid the IRS.
Wow.
This is gross income, 50% that folks are spending on housing, because to live in a place like a DC or a New York or an LA or wherever else where it's just ridiculous, that's what it costs. And then also folks who are cohabitating, for the sake of paying the rent, they're still overstretched.
Right.
So you're cohabitating with somebody who you otherwise probably wouldn't live with to afford rent, but realistically you still can't afford it because you're at that 40-50% threshold. So it's that much more of a stretch. So that rule of thumb sounds great, and if you are somebody who either you make a significant enough income that it works out for you that way, or you live in a place that just hasn't been impacted yet by migrating millennials trying to avoid high housing costs, even though that's coming for you. regardless of where you live. I keep seeing all these lists that are like the 10 best places for millennials to move to so their money goes further. They know about you, St. Paul, Minnesota. Or that's the last one I've read about, but those guys. That rule of thumb sounds good, and in theory it's great. That's what they teach us in classes, but I don't know how realistic that is anymore, unfortunately.
It's interesting. I read a story today, literally, about and I've seen this trend about, talked about cohabitating, where there's a new trend where they're building, like, thinking like of an apartment building, but instead of a full apartment to yourself, you have like a room and a bathroom, and then you share the, like, whatever, the living space.
Common areas.
The common areas, that's the word.
Kind of like a dorm.
It is literally a dorm. It is actually, and you're paying for your room, and then you pay for the bathroom, so that's yours, and that's your space. But the common room you share, but then also the common room you're paying to have it cleaned professionally.
Okay.
So it's interesting because it's like the housing crisis, so to speak, is creating a scenario where grown people are willing to go back into being children at college, and live in a dorm.
You might end up with just a bunch of guys living there. Because as you're describing it, I'll be honest, I was thinking, man, if I was single, I'm 30 years old, and I'm thinking about regressing into this model you're talking about. I was like, that actually sounds kind of okay. I really only need a bedroom, a TV, a bowl, a plate, a spoon, a fork, where all the other stuff that I have is really non-essential.
One wash rag.
If you're talking to me about like $1,000 rent to get to this level of what you're in, that doesn't sound too terrible.
The crazy thing is,
probably just a bunch of guys living this way.
The crazy thing is, one of the articles that I read about this over the last several months, the price point wasn't like what it should be.
Okay.
The price point was still like relatively high for what you're getting for just being in the room.
That's that professional cleaning service.
Well, that's where it comes in. Like, oh yeah, they're gonna clean up for you. They're gonna clean up the common space, which is nice. That'd be nice. But at the same time, it's like, this doesn't feel like the way it's supposed to be going. But whatever. But when you're thinking about like that 30% rule, if somebody's over that, and you can't really control where you are, you can't control where the quote unquote good jobs are, where you want to be. What are some other things people can do to kind of meet or account for that overage of that 28 to 30% of income that's going out the door?
Unfortunately, the other side of it is just their down payment. The more money you can afford to put down, the lower the monthly payment is.
Well, that's
the
if you're
closer to that ratio
That's
is.
if you're going to a house,
right?
But what if like you're renting? Like,
so if you're
fortunately
though, if you're renting, landlords tend to lean toward what the market is dictating. And so if all of the people who are applying for rent at this particular building in this particular zip code are applying and they're looking at 40, 45, 50% of their gross income being what it is, that's what the market tells them they have to take. That's what they take.
Right.
But they also know at the very worst they have you for 12 months and then they can put you out and then move to the next one. So their market constantly moves. It's the mortgage issue that's 30 years of, can we get our money back out of this person? That's really the crux of the issue. Okay. Because, a landlord is going to do what they have to do to get butts in the seats. Like where they offer in D.C., I see it all the time. I don't know where other people are. But they offer you a month or 2 months or even 3 months of free rent to get you in the door, and then they can adjust the price on you later on. Or the price didn't really adjust. You were just numb to it because you had free months ahead of time that you could prorate. And then all of a sudden in month 13, the market rate comes and you're like, nope, gotta go. I know that one firsthand because I moved 3 times following increases on month 13. Where I was like, the 2 months were free, so thank you, but nope, gotta go.
Millennials in D.C. move once a year, basically.
Right, basically.
To get that free 3 months.
3 times within like a half of a square mile every single time. Just chasing free rent.
Absolutely. But we want to remind people you're listening and watching Manage Your Damn Money with Ben and Malcolm. We're going to get to another music break. But before we do, we want to remind you that you can always catch us on Apple Podcasts, SoundCloud, Stitcher, Google Play, and, of course, Spotify. Leave us a review on all of those platforms. That helps us go up in the ratings. If you have a question for us or you want to send a question in for Malcolm's Money Minute, simply send it to us, info@manageyourdamnmoney.com. And you can always catch us on social media. Malcolm, what's your handle?
At Malcolm on Money.
And, of course, mine is at MYDM1. Please follow us. And, of course, you can catch us on Facebook, facebook.com/Manage Your Damn Money. This is MYDM with Ben and Malcolm. We will be right back. Welcome back to Manage Your Damn Money with Ben and Malcolm. Today's conversation at hand for this episode is a simple word: percentages. How much should we spend on what and when? We're answering that question on this episode. Another headline we pulled for this one, Malcolm: here's how much money you should have saved at every age. This was a CNBC.com piece from February of 2017 by Kathleen Elkins. And this is a big one because a lot of times we talk about what we should be doing now, right? Mm-hmm. But this is something that looks at what we should be doing at every age and stage and for the foreseeable future. The first thing they said: when it comes to savings, Americans are falling short. Nearly 70% of adults have less than $1,000 in their savings accounts. Retirement funds are looking equally bleak. In fact, about half of U.S. families have zero retirement in their savings, or zero funds in their retirement accounts. So in your 20s, this piece says, aim to save 25% of your overall gross pay. A person quoted in the story tells CNBC that 25% is a combination of your 401k withholdings, matching from funds from your employer, and any cash savings you have. It can also include debt repayment. Just make sure your lifestyle expenses don't exceed 75% of your gross income. So that's kind of like when you're first starting out, everyone's getting established in their 20s. And that 25% is supposed to, I suppose, be inclusive of all of your retirement efforts as well.
Yeah. Well, I mean, that 25% number, when
what do you think about
first starting out, is probably the most unrealistic.
Is that too high or too low?
Too high.
Really?
25% of your salary.
Yeah.
When you're working your first job out of college.
I was making kibbles and bits when I first got out of grad school.
I don't remember the exact numbers, but let's call it $40,000.
Mm-hmm. I'd have been blessed if it was that high.
$40,000. 25% is $10,000 in DC. Yeah. Which means now, before taxes, I've got $30,000 left to survive on. I just don't see how that even is, or even if I lived in, another part of the country other than DC. Let's take us out of the vacuum.
Right.
That money still, I don't think, would have gone.
Doesn't go nearly as far. Not as far as you'd want it to.
So, I mean, it sounds great to say, I can save 25%.
This is what you should be doing.
But maybe that goes back to the point you made in one of our previous shows about the need to move back in with mom and dad for a year or 2 years or whatever after graduating to get on solid ground to be able to,
In that case, that would make something like that realistic.
Sure. That's the only way something like that is realistic.
Indeed. Also, the next stage, by age 30, have the equivalent of your annual salary saved. The person's quoted in the story says, if you earn $50,000 a year, aim to have $50,000 in your savings when you hit 30, which feels like, that's a massive ask of anyone living in the millennial and possibly Gen Y, Gen Z generation. It feels like maybe if you did go and live at home with mom and dad, but that's a big number.
You would have to be pretty diligent.
Super diligent
to be able to save that much, and I mean, it is doable.
Do you think is that inclusive of retirement or not?
Yes, that is inclusive of.
Okay.
I think the way I understood it, I shouldn't flat out but the way I understood it, that's saying including your retirement savings.
Right.
You should be at 1 year's salary of.
That makes it more realistic.
But also, so part of the reason it's doable, the reason I said that so kind of emphatically, is because part of the way up, your employer is matching your contributions, hopefully,
if you're lucky,
and that's inflating that savings rate that you're able to. So realistically, I think you could have that number saved for retirement and in your regular
by
reserves.
30.
Yeah,
that makes sense.
But you would have had to start immediately after college.
Right, absolutely. Another part of the story said, again, this includes any so this answers the question we were just asking. It includes any retirement account contributions, matching funds from your company, like you said, Malcolm, cash savings or money you've invested elsewhere, index funds or robo-advisors. So that's actually exactly what it is accounting for. Mm-hmm. And if you've been listening to this show and are getting started at the age of 20, that should be a reasonable place to get to if you're making a decent jump in income every few years. It then went on to say, this is where it got not complicated, but it's just a lot of steps. By age 35, have twice your annual salary saved, and of course that's across all of your accounts. By age 40, having 3 times your annual salary saved. By age 45, have 4 times of your annual salary saved. By age 50, have 5 times your annual salary saved. and by age 55 have 6 times, and so on and so forth, up to 60 until you stop working. So it really just, this particular article asks that you multiply basically each time you go up a stage in life.
See, part of the reason I think that particular rule of thumb is a little bit more realistic and more manageable than a lot of the quote-unquote experts that I read on this, is because it actually is basing it off of your life stage, as well as the income that you have respective to where you are. So, you know, if I am a artist, I draw paintings, I illustrate kids' books, let's say, something obscure, for a living. I'm not going to make the same money living in, you know, I don't know, somewhere in Maryland. I'm not going to make the same money as a person who lives in Silicon Valley with that same illustrative skill designing apps for some startup company. Like, it's just not, the math doesn't add up. But fortunately, by basing it off of your income and nothing else, it makes it more relative to where you personally are in your life and at those stages and all that kind of stuff. So I actually prefer that method, that rule of thumb, to where folks are just like, at this point, you should just have flat out $500,000. I don't care what your story is or where you come from or what happened to you along the way. If you don't have this much, feel terrible because you've wasted your life. That's how usually that's how they read. And I've told people to stop listening to quote unquote experts because nobody knows. But, you know, fortunately in this case, it seems a little bit more realistic to me.
And attainable, of course. On Manager Day of Money today, Ben and Malcolm, we're talking about percentages and the percentages of things that you can contribute to this or to that. Other considerations for percentages, credit cards and consumer debt, whether credit cards or other consumer loans, debt that is not a mortgage or a student loan has the greatest impact on your credit score and typically carries high interest rates. You want to make sure to pay off this kind of debt as soon as possible, and that's kind of like a really strong rule of thumb, especially when we're talking about debt, because you know, if you have high balances and it's just rolling over, you're just adding interest to it, and that of course hurts your ability to put any kind of percentage towards anything.
I'm going to add a percentage to that real quick, and also that the credit card conversation that brings in that rule of thumb that you don't want to use more than 30% of whatever your available balances are. Because as soon as you crack that 30% marker, the credit card company starts paying more attention to you and is less likely to release funds to you in the future and all that kind of stuff. So 30% as a percentage, again, since we're on that.
And that's, of course, a percentage of what debt you're using, of what you have available to you.
Specifically for credit cards.
Okay, very good. And then this is an interesting thing. I went home to California, and I was with my friend's, well, I should say my sister's old friend's sister, who I know, who I was cool with too, and I was with her husband, and we were talking about.
So a friend of yours.
Yeah, basically, roundabout way of saying. And her husband was telling me about how they use the Dave Ramsey approach, right? And everyone kind of has at least heard of Dave Ramsey, who's a well-known personal finance, maybe expert.
Maybe not if they're younger than like 50 though.
he's far older than 50. But his thing is, from what I understand, I haven't seen it myself, but from what they told me, the goal is to like save $1,000, and then everything after that you put towards debt. And they were telling me how they did it exactly as it was prescribed, and that they've been knocking out debt left and right. But for me, it was like that, just $1,000, like that made me personally nervous. Like if I only had some small amount like that, if something goes wrong, then I feel like I wouldn't be able to address it.
But we're talking about saving $1,000 out of whatever you have coming in each month. So you otherwise would have spent.
Well, the idea is that you don't save, you rather than save it, you pay off your debt.
Right.
And you get more aggressive with your debt than.
But so where I was going with that is that implies that you were already saving at a ridiculously high, or not ridiculously high, but an accelerated pace. And instead of diverting it to just your savings account, you're now applying it to debt. But if you're a person who's spending and you just so happen to manage to save a couple of dollars after you get done making your minimum debt payments, then this doesn't really apply anyway. And I
think the assumption there is that you're not spending frivolously. But there is a point to be made that you
maybe not even spending frivolously, but you're just stretched thin. You got more month than you got money, as the old people like to say. Then in that case, this Dave Ramsey approach, like, you know, I just told you how I feel about the quote-unquote experts and the one-size-fits-all advice that people tend to give out.
Right. I know for me that $1,000 doesn't feel like enough to handle whatever comes across, and that I would definitely, if possible, want to have more than that saved, even if it meant foregoing paying off like a couple student loans for a little while longer.
So to make sure that I understand what you're saying, you're saying save $1,000 flat and that's it.
That is
not save $1,000 every month.
No.
Okay.
Flat $1,000. Like, as I understood it, he was saying, the way he explained it to me was, or the way that the program is supposed to be, whatever one he was referring to, you're supposed to save $1,000, and then after you have that $1,000, that $1,000 in the bank, literally everything that you make that you could save or do something with, you put it towards your debt to pay it off.
I gotcha. Okay.
And that's the thing that I'm like, it might work, and that's cool, but it just makes me uncomfortable personally.
I think as a couple, maybe that's possible.
Okay.
So if you have two people who generate an income that are working at this,
right, and they both were,
because that whole 3 to 6 months emergency reserve number is contingent on how many people in that house are working and contributing.
That's
right?
true.
So if you have a spouse who also earns an income, that number doesn't need to be as high as if I'm an individual person. I've got one income,
right,
and if it hits the fan, I need a lot of runway to make up. You know, so
that's true.
In that case, I kind of understand where that's coming from, but still, I think $1,000 is dangerous because $1,000 doesn't even cover 1 month of my living expenses. So then, you know,
what are you doing then?
Yeah.
Another element that's important to remember, a particularly nagging expense for our generation. Of course, we know what that is, Malcolm. What's the best approach for student loans as it pertains to the percentage of your income? Do your early earning years prevent you from paying them down, or should you still try? And this was something that I ran into early on in my career, where I didn't have enough to even address it, and I just kept, like, you know, what is it, forbearance, you know, I'll get it to you later. And then looking back, maybe I should have tried, but then it's like a drop in the bucket. I don't know if that would have done anything.
I think part of the challenge with student loans and the way the cost of school in general now is that number just looks so unattainable that you don't even try.
Yeah.
And, you know,
I definitely felt victim
fortunately, I'm not in that position, and so I can't necessarily speak to it from the been there, done that perspective.
Right.
But it just seems to me like when I hear people talk about like 50, 60, 70, 80, $100,000 of student loan debt, and you're a person who's never had more than, you know, $1,000 to your name at any one time, you look at that and you go, well, I'm never going to pay that anyway. I might as well have fun.
Right.
And then you don't even bother to try. And so I think psychologically, it just, you know, you can do all the math you want and make it sound as good as you want to in theory, but realistically, like, how do you even begin to put one foot in front of the other and attack an $80,000 monster? Like, you know.
That's absolutely true, and I definitely fell victim to that. As I said at the top of the show, I just now realized how much I was spending in student loans. On another item, Malcolm, which you'll know something about, investing. The question for you is, what is the gradual allocation that should be put towards investing and retirement as we progress through our career? So, of course, we have, like, that basic whatever percent at work that you should be putting away in your 401k, and then whatever that hopefully you get matched on that. Like, let's just assume that that's happening. What else should people be like putting towards in terms of like automatic investing, you know, a separate IRA account or a basic investing account? Like, what percentage should people start funneling off to that once they get like a little bit of establishment going?
So I personally think that folks who are actually doing that saving to hit that emergency reserve number of 6 months or whatever it is, eventually you'll hit that number, right? If you're diligently going about making sure that you save on a regular enough basis to get there.
Right.
And then once you hit that number, then what? Right. In this case, the bridge you're crossing when you get to it, is you just divert those funds instead of going into emergency reserves like they have been for however long. You divert that exact same amount into some sort of automatic investment portfolio.
Right.
So you always hear me talk about how automating your saving is the best way to go about actually hitting those goals.
Absolutely.
Automating that investing, so every month, every 2 weeks, or however you set it up, having that money go to buy more shares of some mutual fund or an exchange-traded fund or whatever you decide to do, having that money go, instead of going to savings and sitting in cash and earning you close to zero, just start buying investments with that exact same ratio every single month. And, you know, if and when you actually do have to dip into your reserves, divert the money back to sure up that 6-month number and then go right back to doing what you were doing.
Right.
But I think that's probably the best way to, I don't know if dip your toe is, I know that's your favorite way to
dip
your
your toe
phrase,
in the jacuzzi, Malcolm.
But I think that's probably the best way to go after it. That exact same money you're already comfortable with, just divert it to a different activity.
Absolutely. That's some wise but basic words. Another thing to keep in mind, transportation can be one of the largest deductions of anyone's income. Do your best to keep this expense low and save the purchase of the X5 BMW for later. I don't think there's any rule or percentage when it comes to transportation. Just keep it low.
Right, as low as you possibly. So my rule personally is when I buy a new car, I try to buy a car that I can afford to pay off in 3 years.
Okay.
So I stretch the financing out 60 months.
Right.
Is kind of the standard to get whatever the base interest rate you'll get is.
Mm-hmm.
I take the 60-month financing, but pay it at an interval that'll get me to 36 months.
Oh, so on your own.
Right, on my own.
Right.
So I take out the loan for
60.
the it hits the fan scenario. Okay,
Right.
I can at least pay this minimum monthly amount of whatever.
Right.
But I pay it based on a 3-year schedule. Because to
Oh.
me, after I've paid it off 3 years later, now I've got another, let's call it 3 years before stuff just starts happening and I'm like, I got to get a new car.
Right.
So now I paid for it half the time, drove it without paying for it the other half of the time, and I feel a little bit more comfortable that, in a bad scenario, I can still afford to.
That's a wise trick there, sir. It's almost like tricking yourself into what you can afford for real, and then I like that. You know what my solution for transportation is, and I told my wife earlier, I think it was like yesterday. She was like, "What kind of car would you want if we got a second car?" I said, "No car." Like, I don't want a second car. I don't mind walking. I don't mind taking the train.
You're a little more willing to put up with the commute than I am.
Man, look,
I don't want to hear about anybody's bus. I'm liking the metro less and less the older I get.
Okay.
It gets hotter outside, I take the metro less. It rains like it did today, I don't take the metro. So, you're a lot more willing to deal with a little discomfort here to save on owning transportation. I will give you that. In the time I've known you, you have been extremely flexible with transportation, and I'm like, I'll just come up off those dollars. Like, I can't do it.
That's true. Another one, and the last one before we close the show. Child care costs are a beast, especially in metropolitan cities. Be smart and befriend a wonderful elderly woman to take care of your kids. Ours is Miss Gemma. We have a Miss Gemma where we live who has a little business of sorts.
So you already got her planned out.
We have somebody as a potential when we cross that bridge. And, of course, you can live in the same city as a family and get grandma to take care of Junior for free. I don't have any other suggestions when it comes to childcare because I know that that's a really expensive thing. And something that we need to tackle here on this show just to really just talk about how expensive it is.
Yeah, I don't even have anything to offer to it. Like, I don't have any firsthand knowledge.
Right.
Or, like,
yeah. We need to get some,
pray?
We need to get like a nanny on here and then tell us how much money she makes off of something like that. It's interesting. So we want to remind you, this has been an episode of Manager Damn Money.
Did you mention in the intro that this show was designed or asked for?
Yes.
By a member of the.
Why don't you talk about that?
A member of the Montgomery community media crew. So I'm throwing that out there to make sure folks know that we do actually take your show suggestions, seriously.
Indeed, we do.
So do with that what you will.
Absolutely. And we want to, of course, remind people they can always catch past episodes of Manager Damn Money on Apple Podcasts, SoundCloud, Stitcher, Google Play, and now Spotify. Of course, leave us a review or give us a rating on any of those platforms. That helps us go up in the ratings and helps other people learn about our show. If you have a question for Malcolm you want him to do for his Malcolm Money Minute, send it to us, info@managerdamnmoney.com. Also, comments, critiques, tell us how good we're doing, what we can improve. And, of course, you can catch us on social media. My handle is @MYDM1. What about yours, Malcolm?
@MalcolmOnMoney.
And, of course, that's on Twitter and Legram. We want to thank our partners here at Montgomery Community Media once again for another fantastic show. And, of course, you can always catch us on Facebook, facebook.com/ManagerDamnMoney. Until next time, be good with your money.
Peace.
Peace.